Welcome to the Daily MBA, where business wisdom is served fresh and fast, straight from one of the top MBA programs in the world. I'll give you summaries of my lectures and readings, as well as the most important insights gained from an MBA, so you can apply all of this knowledge in every business. Let's get started. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the high-low method and also the cost-volume profit analysis. Let's start with the high-low method. This is going to be a method for attempting to separate out the fixed and variable costs when you have limited amounts of data. So if you were listening to my previous episodes, you saw that we have to figure out which are the fixed costs and which are the variable costs. And even though this might sound intuitive, maybe you don't know which one is which. So the high-low method is going to involve taking the highest level of activity and the lowest level of activity and then comparing the total costs at each level. And this is going to be a familiar approach that managerial accountants use in order to see which costs are fixed and which costs are variable. So if the variable cost is a fixed change per unit and the fixed cost remains the same, then it's going to be possible to determine if this is going to be fixed or variable in a company, at least. So the only thing that I should say is that you should be a bit cautious when using the high-low method, but this is going to give you approximately good results into which are the fixed costs and which are the variable costs. So for doing this high-low method, you're going to have to follow 5 important steps. First step is going to be remove all possible outliers. Because outliers, if you've done any type of data analysis, you're going to see that they always mess everything up. So what we want to do here is just reduce the amount of outliers that you have. And one easy way of doing this would be just putting all your data in a scatter plot and removing the ones that seem to be far off. But another way would be just seeing something that has very high costs and low activity, or very low costs and high activity. This is usually not going to make sense because when you have high activity, you're going to expect higher costs, and when you have low activity, you will expect lower costs. So this is first step, remove outliers. The second step would be adding up all the costs. So variable, fixed, and the mixed. And you want to do this in the high activity levels and also in the low activity levels. So ideally, how this would work, you would find the highest and the lowest, and then you would add up all the costs that you may have in those levels, so fixed, variable, and mixed. Then what you're going to do in the third step is that you're going to take the high costs minus the low costs, and then you're going to divide that by the high activity levels minus the low activity levels. And this would give you an approximate cost per unit. So you want to have that value kept somewhere because it's technically going to be the variable cost that you have per unit. Then for the fourth step, you're going to need an important equation that says total costs will equal the variable cost per unit times the amount of units produced, and then you're going to add to that the fixed cost. So you already have your total costs, and you just got your variable costs from the previous point, from point number 3. So what you want to do is plug in this number, and you're going to multiply it either by high or low end, you decide. And then you'll also take either high or low total cost amount, and this is going to give you a fixed number. Why am I saying that it doesn't matter if it's high or low? Because technically it should be the same. You should get the same amount of fixed costs either in high activity level or low activity level, because that is the main definition of a fixed cost. So once you have that, you're going to be able to get on your fifth and final step an equation for finding out your total costs. And so you have to think of this as kind of a regression. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to give you an estimate of what the fixed costs are and then of the variable costs that you have. And so just in case, so you remember, The total cost will be the sum of the fixed cost plus the variable cost. So your equation would look something like total cost equal fixed cost, which is the amount you found in step number 4, and then plus the amount that you found in step number 3 multiplied by units sold. And this is going to be your total cost equation. And even though it sounds simple, it's actually very used in the industries, and you're going to see that this is a method that gives you an approximation to what the fixed costs are and the variable costs. So it's very useful. Now, let's look at the second type of analysis that I wanted to introduce to you today, and it's the cost volume profit analysis. So this one is usually abbreviated as the CVP, and this is going to be a way to find out how changes in the variable costs and fixed costs will affect a firm's profitability. And so usually companies are going to use CVP to see how many units you need to sell in order to get to break even, which is covering all costs, or maybe even to reach a minimum profit margin that you may like. So CVP analysis is going to take up some of the assumptions, including sales price, fixed and variable cost per unit, and then it's going to give you this number. So it's also, again, a very, very useful tool. For starting to explain this one, you have to understand the basics of profitability, and these are that if you want to increase profitability, you basically only have to increase price, you have to increase quantity, or you have to reduce costs. So those are going to be the only ways of increasing your profitability. And we're going to see that this will be the ways that you're going to be calculating for getting to a break-even point. But before we get into that, let's start looking at all of the parts that are going to be adding up to this CVP analysis. So first, the concepts that you should consider are going to be related to contribution margin. And so contribution margin is going to be the amount that you're technically earning. And so we're going to have many different measures here. One of them is going to be the unit contribution margin, and this one will be the price minus the variable cost per unit. You may also have a contribution margin ratio, which would be the unit contribution margin divided over the price. Then you could also get to that contribution margin ratio, but in another way, which would be taking the total contribution margin and dividing it by the total revenue. In case that's useful, you can use whichever method you like, because sometimes in a company you may have some data, in another company you may have other types of data. But then lastly, ultimately what you're looking for is the profit. So profit is going to be the unit contribution margin times the amount of quantity that you sold, and then all of this minus the fixed costs. So this is going to be relatively simple, and the contribution margins are going to be key numbers that you should be paying attention to in any type of company that you're studying. Another way that you could think about it could be kind of like creating your net income, but around the contribution margin. So usually what you want to start with is always revenue, which will be price times quantity. But then you want to subtract from that the variable costs. And this is going to be kind of the variable cost per unit times the quantity. Then this is going to be giving you the total contribution margin from a company. And after you take from those the fixed cost, this would give you the net income. So it's basically what I just said, but plotted out in a way that looks a little bit similar to financial accounting. So you're going to start from the revenue, then to get to contribution margin, and lastly to net income. Now that you have those numbers, you can move on to the next step, which would be finding out what's the break-even point. So as I told you earlier, break-even point is going to be the point where you're covering up all your costs. So it's the point that every company wants to get to. And for getting to this point, you must know that you may find the break-even point in units sold, break-even point in dollars, or you may also find it in the last method that I'm going to show you. So let's start with the one in units. for this one, you'll have to take your fixed costs divided the unit contribution margin, and just that will give you the break-even point in units. So how many units of something do you have to sell in order to get to break-even? You could also find the break-even point in dollars, and that would be having your fixed costs divided by the contribution margin ratio this time. And that will give you the amount in dollars. But one intuitive way, which is the one that you would ideally like to have, is having revenues minus variable costs minus fixed costs. All of this should always equal 0. So how I like to think of this third method is just a checking point to see if all the calculations you've done are done correctly. So always you should get to this point to validate if your previous assumptions were correct. But so 3 ways of getting to break-even point, I would recommend doing number 3 always, and then you can decide if the other one you do it in units or in dollars. What you could also try to do in the CVP analysis would be how much would you have to pay or how much pricing you should put if you have a target amount of sales. So let's say, for example, that I have a target of sales of $20,000. And therefore, that would imply that my revenues minus my costs are going to be $20,000. So what I should do then is determine which is going to be my price multiplied by my quantity. Then from that, I'm going to take away the variable costs times the quantity, and then I'm going to take away the fixed cost. So this is the equation that you already know. But all of this should give us 20,000. So now what you have to do is, again, plug in the numbers that you would like to replace, and then just find out which is the missing piece in order to get to that target sales goal that you wanted to have. Something that you should also consider when doing the CVP would be adding up a margin of safety. And you can add a margin of safety in dollars, or you can have a ratio. So for determining the margin of safety amount in dollars, you should take the expected number of sales minus the break-even sales. So this difference between what you're expecting and then what you should get in order to get to break-even, it's going to be kind of like your cushion for safety. So you want to have this one relatively high, not super high, but relatively high. And then the higher it is, better it is for you, because it means that you're going to be having all of this extra in case sales don't go out as planned. Then, margin of safety could also be measured in a ratio. So you should get a margin of safety in dollar amounts and then divide that by the expected sales. So this one's going to be a little bit more tricky. I believe that finding it in dollar amount is going to be easier to understand, but still you can find it however you want. The last and final concept that I want to mention in this CVP analysis would be operating leverage. So operating leverage is going to be a formula that will measure the degree to which a firm or a project can increase its operating income by increasing its revenue. And so this is going to be used to calculate a company's break-even point, but also to help to set appropriate selling prices to cover all the costs and what every company wants, generate more profit. So companies that have high operating leverage must cover a large amount of fixed costs, usually every month, regardless of whether they sell any units of the product or not. So it's going to be a little bit more tricky and more difficult for these companies, but also the reward will then be higher. Then low operating leverage companies may have costs that are going to vary directly with their sales, but that have lower fixed costs to cover each month. So the way of finding out your operating leverage is going to be taking up your fixed costs and dividing that by your total costs, and this is going to give you the amount of operating leverage that you currently have. The degree of operating leverage could also be determined by taking your contribution margin and dividing that by your operating income. Or you may want to turn things around and you may want to find a percent change in the operating income. So for that, you would have to take the degree of operating leverage, which I just told you how to get, and then you're going to multiply that by the percent change of sales. So with this, you already have two important tools that you can use to determine which are going to be the fixed and variable costs in your company. And then you may also want to do the CVP analysis in order to determine how it's going to be your profitability and which decisions you need to take in order to get to break-even point. If you want to continue learning more about managerial accounting and these costing methods, make sure to check out my next episode where I'll explain 3 different types of costing methods. Also, share this episode with your friends if you believe it is useful. Give me a review if you like the content that I'm creating, and be sure to check out my notes in the link that's in the description below. I'll see you next week to keep on learning more.